The sun was going down slowly, painting the small town in soft orange light. The streets were almost empty. Shops were closing one by one. Only a few cars moved on the road. It was one of those evenings where everything felt quiet, but inside, people carried their own heavy stories. John walked slowly along the street. He was a man in his late 40s. His clothes were simple, a little worn out, but clean. He did not look dangerous, nor did he look weak. He was just ordinary. The kind of person people pass every day but never notice. John had spent the whole day working. His hands were tired, his back ached, and his eyes showed a kind of silent pain. He was hungry, but more than food, he wanted peace. He wanted a place where he could sit, eat, and feel human again. Across the street, he saw the bright neon lights of a small diner. The signboard flickered, but the warm smell of food reached him. Inside, laughter and chatter filled the air. It looked like a friendly place. John thought maybe tonight would be better if he just sat there for a meal. He pushed open the glass door, and a little bell rang above him. The sound should have felt welcoming, but strangely, the noise inside grew quieter. People turned their heads for a second, looked at him, and then went back to their food. Some smiled politely, others ignored him completely. John walked to an empty table near the corner. The seat was old, the leather cracked. He placed his tired hands on the table and waited. He did not demand attention, he was patient. A young waiter walked past him, carrying plates of food for another table. John smiled gently and raised his hand. "Excuse me," he said softly. The waiter barely glanced at him. "Wait a minute," he muttered, his tone sharp, almost irritated. Then he walked away without stopping. John lowered his hands slowly. He told himself maybe the boy was just busy. He tried not to take it to heart. He waited, and waited. Minutes passed. The sound of spoons hitting plates, people laughing, and glasses clinking filled the room. The smell of fried chicken and fresh coffee teased his empty stomach. John looked around. Everyone else seemed to be served quickly. Only his table was forgotten. Finally, the waiter came, holding a notepad. His expression showed no smile, only boredom. "What do you want?" he asked coldly. John cleared his throat. "Just a cup of coffee, and maybe a sandwich." His voice was polite, almost too polite. The waiter rolled his eyes. "That it?" "Yes," John said quietly. The waiter didn't write it down. He just turned and walked away, mumbling something under his breath that John couldn't hear. But the people at the next table did. They looked at John, some with pity, others with curiosity. Nobody said anything. John waited again. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. No food, no coffee. His stomach growled, but what hurt more was the feeling of being invisible. When the waiter finally returned, he placed the coffee cup harshly on the table. Some of it spilled over the edge. The sandwich came on a cracked plate, as if it had been thrown together in a hurry. John looked at it silently. He said nothing about the bad service. He simply folded his hands and whispered a quiet thank you. The waiter didn't even reply. He just walked away. John took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, almost burnt. The sandwich was cold. Still, he ate slowly. Not because he liked it, but because he had no choice. At another table, two young men laughed and whispered. One of them looked at John and said loudly enough for others to hear, "Why does he even come here? He looks like he doesn't belong." The other chuckled. "Yeah, maybe he doesn't have anywhere else to go." Their laughter echoed in John's ears. He did not look at them. His eyes stayed on his plate. His hands trembled slightly, but he controlled himself. The whole diner seemed to agree silently. Some people avoided looking at him. Others gave quick glances, filled with silent judgment. John finished half his sandwich and left the rest. He placed a few crumpled bills on the table, more than enough to pay the bill. As he stood up, the waiter finally gave him a mocking smile. "Come again," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. John looked at him, not with anger, but with calm eyes that hid a storm inside. He simply nodded and walked out. The bell above the door rang again as he left. This time, nobody noticed. The diner returned to laughter, chatter, and noise, as if John had never been there. Outside, the night air was cold. John walked slowly, his hands deep in his pockets. Each step felt heavy. He replayed the whole scene in his mind, how he was treated like he was nothing. He whispered to himself, "People see only what's outside, they never ask what's inside." The moon shone above, casting a pale light on the empty street. John kept walking until his figure faded into the darkness. What nobody knew was that tonight's silence in John's heart was not weakness. It was the calm before the storm. Tomorrow, everything would change. The streets were quiet as John walked home. His steps were slow, almost dragging. The lights from the diner still glowed behind him, but in his heart, there was only darkness. He reached his small apartment on the edge of town. The building was old, the walls cracked, and the stairway smelled of dust and rust. He unlocked his door and entered the room. Inside, everything was simple. A small wooden table. A single chair. A bed pushed against the wall. A shelf with a few books, some photographs, and nothing more. It was not much, but it was his space. A space where he could breathe. John closed the door softly. For a long moment, he just stood there in silence. He leaned against the wall, letting out a deep sigh. His chest felt heavy, not because of hunger, but because of the way he was treated. He sat down on the edge of the bed. His hands covered his face. He did not cry, but his silence was louder than any tears. John had lived with loneliness for years. It was not new to him. People had ignored him before. People had judged him before. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the disrespect cut deeper. His stomach growled again. He had barely eaten the cold sandwich, but he didn't care. The hunger inside his heart was stronger than the hunger in his body. On the table sat a small picture frame. John reached for it. It was an old photograph of a smiling woman and a young boy. The woman's hand rested gently on the boy's shoulder. The boy's eyes were bright, full of dreams. John stared at the picture for a long time. His hand shook as he touched the glass. "I miss you both," he whispered. Years ago, his wife and son had been everything to him. They had filled his world with joy. But life had taken them away too soon. His wife passed after a long illness, and his son moved far away, chasing a future that John couldn't give him here. Since then, John had lived in silence. He worked small jobs, kept to himself, and carried his pain alone. People only saw an ordinary, quiet man. They never knew the battles he had already fought. He placed the picture back on the table and leaned back in his chair. His eyes stared at the ceiling, lost in thought. Why do people treat others this way? He asked himself softly. Do they think respect is only for those with money, with power, with status? The words hung in the air, unanswered. John stood up and walked to the small window. The night outside was calm. A few stars shone above the dark sky. He placed his hands on the window frame and looked out. Somewhere in the distance, laughter came from a bar. Somewhere else, a dog barked. Life continued, but for John, the world felt frozen. His mind went back to the diner. He could still hear the waiter's harsh tone, the mocking smile, the laughter of the two young men. He could still feel the cold stares, the silence of the people who saw what happened but chose to do nothing. That silence had hurt him most. Not the waiter. Not the rude customers. But the silence of everyone else. John whispered again, one voice of kindness could have changed everything tonight. He sat back down and opened a small wooden box on the shelf. Inside were pieces of his past, letters, old medals, a folded flag, and a few keepsakes. He picked up one of the medals, its surface scratched but still shining faintly in the dim light. This medal was a reminder of the days when John had served his country with honor. He had once worn a uniform. He had once been saluted. He had once been respected by strangers. But now? He was just another face in the crowd. Another man people overlooked. John turned the medal in his hand. His reflection shone faintly on its surface. He smiled bitterly. If they only knew. He placed the medal back carefully and closed the box. He did not want glory. He did not want fame. He only wanted to be treated with simple respect, the way every human deserves. The room grew colder as the night deepened. John pulled a blanket over himself and lay on the bed. His eyes remained open, staring into the darkness. Sleep did not come easily. His mind replayed the events of the evening again and again, each time cutting deeper into his heart. He thought about leaving the town. He thought about disappearing somewhere new. But then, another thought entered his mind. What if tomorrow, he did not remain silent? The idea stayed with him. Not anger. Not revenge. But something else, something stronger. He whispered into the darkness, tomorrow will be different. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, marking each second. Outside, the world was still. Inside, John's heart beat with a new rhythm. For years, he had carried his pain quietly. For years, he had accepted disrespect as part of life. But tonight, something changed inside him. He did not know exactly what tomorrow would bring. But deep down, he felt a strange fire in his chest. A fire that came not from hate, but from truth. As he finally closed his eyes, one thought echoed in his mind. No one deserves to be treated as less. Not me. Not anyone. And with that silent promise, John drifted into a restless sleep, waiting for the dawn of a new day. Because tomorrow, everything would begin to change. The first light of morning slipped through the cracks of John's small window. The golden rays touched his face, waking him from a restless sleep. His eyes opened slowly. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then the memories of last night rushed back, the diner, the rude waiter, the laughter, the silence. He sat up on the edge of his bed, his body heavy but his mind strangely clear. Normally, mornings felt like just another start to another lonely day. But today was different. Today, something inside him had changed. John walked to the sink and splashed cold water on his face. The reflection in the cracked mirror showed a man with tired eyes but a strong jaw, a man who had lived through storms and still stood tall. He stared at himself for a long moment. You are not nothing, he whispered. You never were. He dried his face with an old towel and went to the small wooden box on the shelf. He opened it slowly, as if touching a piece of his soul. Inside lay his past medals, letters, a folded flag, reminders of battles fought and sacrifices made. John picked up one medal, holding it carefully in his palm. The medal was cool against his skin, but in his heart, it burned with memories. He remembered the long nights under the sky, the faces of men who stood beside him, the moments when courage was the only choice. He placed the medal back with care. Then he pulled out a small, worn notebook. Its pages were filled with his handwriting, thoughts, lessons, pieces of wisdom he had gathered through years of pain and survival. He read a line he had written long ago. Respect is not a gift for the rich or powerful. Respect is the right of every soul. John closed the notebook, his jaw tightening. He dressed neatly that morning. His shirt was ironed, his shoes polished, his hair combed with care. He did not look like a broken man anymore. He looked like someone with purpose. Before leaving, he picked up the photograph of his wife and son. He smiled softly, touching the glass. Today, I will make you proud, he whispered. The streets were busier now. People rushed to work, cars moved quickly, children laughed on their way to school. Life looked normal to everyone else. But for John, every step felt like part of a quiet mission. He walked with calm confidence, his shoulders straight, his head high. For years, he had hidden himself in the shadows. Today, he would no longer hide. As he approached the diner, the neon lights flickered once again. The same place that had humiliated him last night stood in front of him, filled with laughter and noise. John stopped outside for a moment. His heart beat faster. A voice inside whispered, "Turn back. Don't go in." But another voice, stronger, deeper, said, "No. This is the moment." He pushed the glass door open. The little bell rang above him again. This time, he did not shrink into the corner. He walked straight to the same table, sat down calmly, and folded his hands. The customers looked up, recognizing him. Some whispered to each other. The same waiter from last night saw him and frowned. His voice carried the same coldness. "You again," he said. "What do you want this time?" John looked straight into his eyes. His voice was steady. "Breakfast," he said simply. "And a cup of coffee." The waiter smirked. "Sure. Let's see if you can pay for it this time." A couple of people chuckled at the remark. John heard it, but he did not flinch. He kept his calm. As the waiter walked away, John placed the photograph of his wife and son on the table beside him. He looked at it, not with sadness, but with strength. He knew who he was. He knew what he carried inside. Around him, the diner buzzed with noise. But soon, something would happen that would change the air completely. For now, John waited quietly, his presence stronger than it had ever been. His silence was no longer the silence of weakness. It was the silence of someone who carried truth. No one in that diner knew what was about to come. No one knew the man sitting in the corner was about to shake their hearts. Because today, the world would finally see who John really was. The diner buzzed with the same morning energy, plates clattering, voices rising, coffee machines humming. People laughed, talked, and lived their ordinary lives. But at one corner table, John sat quietly, waiting. The same waiter came back with his order. The plate was dropped onto the table with little care, the coffee placed roughly so it almost spilled. The waiter gave a half-smile full of sarcasm. "There you go, sir," he said, dragging the word "sir" as if it were a joke. John looked at the food, then at the waiter. His eyes were calm, steady, almost too steady. "Thank you," he said softly. The waiter frowned. He expected anger, maybe complaints, maybe even a fight. But John's calmness unsettled him. Without another word, the waiter walked away. John ate slowly, each bite filled with quiet dignity. Around him, people noticed. Some remembered last night. They whispered, "That's the same man. Why did he come back? Doesn't he feel ashamed?" But John showed no shame. He sat tall, his hands steady, his eyes clear. Then, just as the diner settled back into its noisy rhythm, the little bell above the door rang again. Everyone looked up. An older man entered, dressed neatly in a dark suit, carrying himself with authority. His face was lined with wisdom, his walk confident. Behind him came two others, younger, carrying cameras and notebooks. They looked official. The staff quickly straightened up. Even the rude waiter's tone changed. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice suddenly polite. The man in the suit scanned the room. His eyes stopped at John. For a moment, his face froze. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his lips. He walked straight to John's table. The whole diner went silent. "John," the man said warmly. "Is that really you?" John looked up, surprised but calm. "Yes," he answered. "It's been a long time." The man reached out and shook John's hand firmly, with respect. "It's an honor to see you again," he said, his voice carrying through the diner. "We've been searching for you." The waiter blinked in confusion. You know him?" The man in the suit turned, his eyes sharp. "Know him? This man is a hero. A decorated veteran. He saved lives that can never be repaid." Gasps filled the diner. Customers exchanged stunned looks. Whispers spread quickly. Did he say hero? Wait, that ordinary man? I thought he was just some poor nobody. The man in the suit continued, his voice filled with emotion. Years ago, John risked his life for his team, for his country, for people he didn't even know. He never asked for fame, never asked for anything in return. And now, after all these years, here he is, sitting quietly, like always. The two men with notebooks began snapping pictures, writing notes. The camera flash lit the room. The diner was no longer just a diner. It had become a stage, and John was at the center. The rude waiter's face turned pale. His hands trembled slightly as he held a tray. He remembered every word he had said last night, every insult, every mocking smile. Shame burned his cheeks. John sat still. He did not smile proudly. He did not boast. He simply said, "I was only doing my duty." Nothing more. But his humility made the moment even heavier. The silence in the diner was thick, broken only by the clicking of the camera. The man in the suit placed a hand on John's shoulder. The town deserves to know the kind of man living among them. The world needs to remember that heroes don't always wear uniforms forever. Sometimes, they sit quietly at a corner table, unseen, unrecognized. Tears filled the eyes of some customers. Others bowed their heads in guilt, remembering how they had judged him without knowing. The two young men who had laughed at John the night before avoided his gaze, their faces red with shame. Even the waiter, his pride crushed, walked slowly toward John. His voice shook as he whispered, "Sir. I'm sorry." John looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke, his words simple but sharp. Respect should not depend on knowing someone's story. It should be given freely, because every human deserves it. The words hung in the air like a lesson carved into stone. No one dared to speak. Finally, the man in the suit gestured to his team. "Come, John. We want to honor you properly. The diner is not big enough to hold your story." But John shook his head. He stayed seated, finishing the last sip of his coffee. "No," he said quietly. "I don't need ceremonies. I only need people to remember one thing: never look down on anyone." He stood up slowly, his figure tall and unshaken. The photograph of his wife and son still sat on the table. He picked it up gently, slipped it into his pocket, and turned toward the door. The bell rang again as he stepped outside, but this time, the sound was not ordinary. It was the sound of a lesson entering every heart inside the diner. Everyone watched him leave in silence. No one laughed. No one mocked. No one dared to look away. Because in that moment, they finally saw John not as an invisible man, but as a living reminder that true greatness often hides in silence. And what had begun as just another ordinary morning had turned into a story that none of them would ever forget. The door closed softly behind John as he stepped out into the bright morning. The sound of the little bell above the diner faded, leaving behind a silence so heavy that no one inside dared to break it. The diner, once filled with laughter and noise, now sat frozen. Every person's eyes were fixed on the door where John had just walked out. For a moment, it was as if the world itself had stopped moving. The man in the suit slowly lowered his hand from where it had rested on John's shoulder. He looked around at the stunned faces. "Now you know," he said quietly. His voice carried not just to the ears, but deep into the hearts of everyone present. The rude waiter's knees felt weak. He gripped the tray in his hands until his knuckles turned white. His mind replayed every word he had spoken to John, every careless insult, every mocking tone. His chest felt tight, his face hot with shame. He wanted to run, to hide, but there was no escaping what he had done. One of the customers whispered, He's a war hero?" Another shook her head in disbelief. "And we treated him like nothing." The two young men who had laughed the loudest the night before sat stiffly at their table. Their food lay untouched. One of them pressed his hands together, whispering to himself, "I wish I could take it back. I didn't know. I didn't know who he was." But the truth cut deeper than that. It wasn't about who John was. It was about how they had chosen to treat him before they knew. The man in the suit turned to the room. His eyes were sharp, filled with disappointment. "Do you see what happened here?" he asked. "Yesterday, this man was invisible to you. He was mocked, ignored, disrespected. But the moment you learned who he really was, your hearts changed. Why? Should respect only be given after you discover someone's worth? No one answered. Heads hung low. Guilt filled the air heavier than smoke. The waiter finally set the tray down and walked forward. His voice shook, almost breaking. I didn't mean. I was just busy, I didn't think. The man in the suit cut him off with a sharp look. You didn't think, because you didn't care. And that is worse than any insult. The waiter's eyes filled with tears. He wiped them quickly, but nothing could wash away the truth. One by one, the customers began to feel the weight of their silence. They remembered how they had looked at John. How none of them had spoken up for him. How they had let the humiliation happen right in front of them. A woman at the corner table whispered, her voice trembling, I saw it all, and I said nothing. I was afraid to get involved. But now I realize, my silence was the same as cruelty. The words spread like fire. Others nodded, their faces pale with realization. The truth was undeniable, they had failed not because they didn't know John's identity, but because they hadn't chosen kindness. The man in the suit sighed deeply. His voice softened. Respect is not a prize. It is not something you give only to heroes. It is the most basic thing one human can give to another. And yesterday, every one of you forgot that. The weight of his words sank into their hearts. The rude waiter could no longer hold back. His head dropped, and tears slipped down his cheeks. I disrespected a man who risked his life for people like me. And worse. I disrespected him simply because I thought he was ordinary. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was heavy, filled with guilt, filled with a painful kind of realization. For the first time, people looked at the empty table where John had sat not as a place for an invisible stranger, but as a sacred reminder. The two young men stood slowly. One of them whispered, we laughed at him. We mocked him. But he didn't fight back. He didn't insult us. He just carried himself with dignity. He's more of a man than we'll ever be. The man in the suit looked at them with sharp eyes. Then learn from him. Don't waste this moment. Change yourselves before it's too late. The young men nodded, their pride shattered, their arrogance replaced with quiet shame. The customers began to murmur, their voices soft but full of regret. We will never forget this. This place will never be the same again. He taught us something without even trying. The diner owner, an older woman with gray hair, finally stepped forward. She had been in the back when John entered, but now she understood everything. Her hands shook as she spoke. From this day forward, no one who enters this diner will ever be treated the way John was treated. Not here. Not ever again. The people nodded. They knew her words were true. But deep inside, they also knew something else. John had left them with more than guilt. He had left them with a responsibility to change, to live differently, to treat every person with respect no matter what. Outside, John walked down the street, unaware of the storm of emotions he had left behind. Or maybe he did know. Maybe he had always known that silence could teach louder than anger, and humility could strike harder than pride. Inside the diner, the shock slowly melted into realization. Every person there felt as if they had been given a mirror. In that mirror, they saw not John, but themselves. And they didn't like what they saw. The diner remained quiet long after John had left. The sound of forks and spoons, the laughter, the casual noise, it was all gone. Instead, the air carried something heavier, the weight of guilt, respect, and deep thought. Every face inside the diner told the same story. People were no longer looking at each other as strangers. They were looking at themselves, remembering the way they had judged a man before they knew his truth. The rude waiter sat in the corner, his apron still tied around his waist, but his spirit crushed. He rubbed his face with his hands, whispering, "How could I do that? How could I look at a man and see less, when he was more than I could ever be?" One of the young men who had laughed at John spoke softly, almost to himself. "We treated him like a joke. But he showed more strength by staying calm than we showed in all our arrogance. He didn't need to prove who he was. His silence was stronger than our voices. The man in the suit stood near the door, watching the people wrestle with their own hearts. His voice, when it came, was steady but gentle. Remember this day. Remember the shame you feel right now. Let it change you. Because John was right, respect is not a reward. It is the simplest gift you can give. And it costs you nothing. The diner owner wiped her eyes with the edge of her apron. She spoke firmly, her voice carrying across the room. From this day, this diner will stand for respect. No one will be ignored here. No one will be treated as less. If you walk through these doors, you will be seen, you will be served with dignity, no matter who you are. Heads nodded around the room. People felt the truth of her words deep inside. One customer whispered, "I will teach my children this. I will tell them about the man we saw today. About how we all failed, and how he taught us without anger." Another added, "I will never again look at a stranger and think they are less than me. I don't know their story. I don't know their battles." The realization spread like a fire. Each person felt it burning inside them, the need to live differently, to treat others better, to never repeat the mistake of that night. Meanwhile, John walked slowly down the quiet street, the photograph of his wife and son resting safely in his pocket. The morning sun shone brighter now, and the air felt lighter. He did not need applause. He did not need recognition. He had given them something far greater, a lesson they would carry for life. His steps were calm, but his heart was steady. He whispered softly to himself, "This was never about me. This was about respect. About reminding them of what it means to be human." Back at the diner, the man in the suit gathered his papers and prepared to leave. Before stepping out, he turned one last time to the people. "Let this moment change not just today, but tomorrow, and every day after. Because true respect is not shown when someone is powerful, it is shown when someone is ordinary." With that, he walked out, leaving the diner in silence again. The rude waiter finally spoke, his voice cracked but sincere. "I will find him. I will apologize, not for who he is, but for how I treated him when I thought he was nobody." And in that promise lay the beginning of his change. Outside, John reached the edge of town. He paused, looked up at the sky, and let the sunlight warm his face. A gentle smile appeared on his lips. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen not by the eyes of others, but by the truth inside himself. He whispered a final thought to the wind, "Respect is the one thing we can give to every soul. And sometimes, when you give it, you change not just their life, but your own." The wind carried his words like a secret message, drifting back toward the diner, toward the people whose hearts had been broken open by the weight of their actions. And from that day forward, the diner was never the same again. Customers came and went, but the story of the quiet man named John lived in every corner. It lived in the way the waiters spoke kindly, in the way strangers smiled at each other, in the way no one was ever ignored again. The lesson had been planted deep. Never judge a person by what you see. Never hold back respect until you know their story. Because behind every face is a journey you cannot imagine. And so, John's silence had spoken louder than 1,000 words. His calm had broken through their pride. His humility had taught them more than anger ever could. And though he walked away without looking back, his presence remained forever in their hearts.